Assalamu alaikum. This is the second video in a two-part video series on the process by which the Quran was collected. The first video should be right up there. There should be a link to it right up there if I have figured out how to use YouTube. If I haven't, you'll find it in the selections of videos on this YouTube channel. Now, the Prophet, as is covered in the first video, was known to have dedicated quite some effort to preserving the Quran, both by teaching his companions how to memorize it and by having several companions learn how to read and write. So it was a preservation of the Quran fi sudur wa fi sutur, in breasts and in writing, as we say in Arabic. But by the end of his life, in the year 632, many companions were known to have memorized the Quran, and many others were learned in how to read and write the Quran. Among those who are said to have had their own collections of some kind in place, some say that Abdullah bin Mas'ud had the most extensive collection. Salim, Mawla Hudhayfa, the freed slave of Hudhayfa, is also known to have had his own collection, though we don't know how extensive it was. There are also reports that the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali bin Abi Talib, had dedicated himself to collecting the Quran entirely upon the death of the Prophet, and that he actually took an oath that he would not leave his house except for prayers and calls of nature until he had finished the task. In addition to this, Ubay bin Ka'ab and Abu Musa al-Ash'ari are also said to have had their own collections. If we are to take the accounts of the collection of the Quran at face value, there are also many other companions who had parchments, date palms, and the shoulder blades of camels on which they had written down parts of the Quran or even several surahs. Unfortunately, there are no extant manuscripts of these collections from the companions. There might be one collection. According to Bethnam Sadiqi, he thinks that the underscript of the Sana 1 manuscript reflects some of the variations that were attributed to the collection of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, but that is something that is to some degree debated still. Now, in addition to this, there are reports that some of the earlier collections of the companions actually differed somewhat from the Quran, that is the collection of the Quran that we have today. These weren't significant. It's not like there were other verses that were different in some way, but an example of this is the collection of Ali bin Abi Talib. It is reported that he actually collected, or it's reported by some, this is Jalaluddin As-Suyuti says this in his Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran. He says that there are reports that Ali bin Abi Talib's collection was arranged in chronological order with some notes as to which verses abrogated previous verses. The first official collection of the Quran occurred under the caliphate of Abu Bakr, which was from the year 632 to 634. In the year 632, the Muslims lost many fighters at the Battle of Yamama. The exact number is disputed, and there's a report that among them there were 70 Qurra, that is, people who were reciters of the Quran, or people who had extensive knowledge, and some people even say people who had memorized the whole of the Quran. Whatever the number may have been and the extent of their knowledge, this was of concern to the Muslim community. And it created a situation where Umar ibn al-Khattab went to the Caliph Abu Bakr and said, if we lose more people in similar battles with knowledge of Quran, then the Quran will itself be lost, or parts of the Quran will be lost. He thus encouraged Abu Bakr to collect the whole of the Quran. Abu Bakr was at first hesitant, but was then persuaded by Umar ibn al-Khattab. They called upon Zayd bin Thabit, who had been one of the closest scribes of the Prophet, as mentioned in the first video, and implored him to take this task upon himself. Zayd bin Thabit was in many ways a natural choice to lead the committee for the collection of the Quran. He had been one of the closest scribes of the Prophet. He is reported to have memorized the whole of the Quran. He was young and energetic, and he was also known for his piety and honesty. Now, he was instructed by the Caliph Abu Bakr to sit by the Prophet's mosque and call upon anybody who had some part of the Quran preserved to bring it to him. And that he was supposed to bring 2 witnesses. Now, what exactly the 2 witnesses meant is not entirely clear. What it seems to have meant is that he had to have anyone who could verify, and have 2 people who could verify that a particular recording of the Quran that they had, or preservation of the Quran that they had come directly from the Prophet. But Zayd could not rely upon his own memory of the text. He had to have other people come in, and this process is dealt with extensively in this book by Mustafa al-Azami, and it's probably the best accounting of this process in the English language for sure, and probably actually in any language, because he's put together texts from many traditions that not everyone else has gathered in one place. But then he went through this process, and as Shawqi Daif has said, Bilal bin Rabah went through the streets of Medina and told anyone to bring Quran if they had it. Now, what we understand from the process is that it had to be people who could attest that it came directly from the Prophet. So in other words, no second-hand or third-hand memorization or writings of the Quran were to be included in the process. Regarding the process, Zayd bin Thabit himself said that he collected the Quran from parchments, that is, from animal skins, from date palm leaves, from camel bones, and from the breasts of people, meaning from people's memories. According to Sahih Bukhari, which is regarded by Sunni Muslims as the most authentic collection of sayings regarding the life of the Prophet and of the Prophet, according to Sahih Bukhari, the collection of the Quran that Zayd bin Thabit put together was with Abu Bakr until he passed away. It was then with Umar ibn Khattab, who was the next caliph, until he passed away. And upon Umar's passage, it went to his daughter Hafsa, who was also a widow of the Prophet. The result of this was that they came to be known as the Suhuf of Hafsa, or the pages of Hafsa. Now, during the caliphate of Umar ibn Khattab, which lasted from the year 634 until the year 644, Islam spread like wildfire. As a result, the Quran also spread to all of these particular places. Umar sent official Quran teachers to places such as Basra and Kufa, Damascus, Hims, Palestine. We have records of who all of these teachers were and who also many of their students were and how they went through this process. But each one of them, of course, had his own collection of some kind, since the first collection wasn't an official one that everyone was being asked to follow. Now, during the caliphate of Uthman, which lasted from 644 to 656, Islam spread even further. And there is a report that one person by the name of Hudhayfa bin al-Yaman came to Uthman from the frontiers and reported that there had been many people reciting the Quran in very different ways. And he implored the Caliph Uthman to gather the community upon a single mushaf, or a single reading of the Quran. This and other accounts led the Caliph Uthman to call together many of the leaders of the Muslim community in Medina and to tell them that he had decided that he would join the Ummah, the Muslim community, on a single mushaf, or a single kind of codex of the Quran. For this process, he again called upon Zayd bin Thabit. Now, there are a few different reports as to what exactly happened here. Some people say that the first codex was simply recorded, that is the suhuf that were in the hands of Hafsa. Other people say that a completely independent collection was done for this second one. Now, exactly what happened isn't entirely clear, but in either account, the suhuf of Hafsa, that is the first collection done by Zayd bin Thabit, did play an important role. as had been done under Abu Bakr. Under Uthman, he enlisted Zayd bin Thabit to head the process of collecting the Quran. Now, according to some accounts, Zayd was the head of a council of 12 other companions, all of whom had knowledge of the Quran, and they again went through the process of collecting Quran from different companions in Medina. Now, there would have been other people who would have been present at this time because in the previous collection, some people had been on campaigns in various places. So this might have been a way to include more people in the process and make sure for a second time that everything was indeed as it had been, or as it was supposed to be. Now, in the process of the second collection, there is a report that Zayd bin Thabit said when he was going over the Uthmanic Codex, or Mus'haf, that he found that one verse was missing. It was verse 23 from Surah 33. And then he went and he found that verse with Khuzaymah bin Thabit. Now, what this means, according to Mustafa al-Azami, who is far more learned in this than am I, he says that this indicates that Zayd bin Thabit was being extremely thorough and making sure that he could find another person with a record who was outside of the council of 12 people who were enlisted in this task, so that that person could give them a verification of what they themselves remembered regarding the Quran. So Azami takes this as being an indication of how thorough this process had been. Now, after the Quran had been collected all together, and the Uthmanic Mus'haf had been checked against the memories of Zayd bin Thabit and the other members of the council for the collection, and then it had been checked against the Suhuf of Hafsa, that is the first collection Zayd had done. It was then copied over in multiple copies that were then distributed throughout the Islamic world in various parts. There are some accounts that say that there were 9 copies that were made and were distributed throughout the Islamic world. Others say 5 copies, others say 7 copies. In many ways, exactly how many copies was made isn't so important. What is important is that those copies were then sent with people who were trained as reciters of the Quran to recite it. And that in other parts of the Islamic world where there were already Quran teachers, it was adopted. There was a little bit of, for example, some people will say that Abdullah bin Mas'ud had objected to some degree, and that there were people who continued to study from the Mus'haf of Abdullah bin Mas'ud. But from the written record that we have today, this did indeed become the standard codex of the Quran from the middle of the 7th century until today. Now, one of the things that is often asked is what was the difference between these two collections, the first collection and the second collection? I think that one of the reasons, and this is my personal opinion, one of the reasons why we might have had the second collection is that at this time the Muslims actually had access to the technologies and the materials from the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire, parts of which they had conquered. As a result, they probably had a lot more parchment, stuff that they had gotten from Byzantine storehouses and things like that, and this made possible the copying of many different copies of the Quran on parchment, especially since it had leaves that were all the same size. This is somewhat of a speculation on my part, but it might be one of the explanations for why a more rigorous process was done at this time before multiple copies were sent out across the Islamic world. Now, this second official collection of the Quran, known as the Uthmanic Codex, was still not written like the Quran that we have today. There were not dots that distinguished similar consonants from one another, and there weren't vowels on the text. To give an example, it would be as if one had English that was written without ascenders and descenders that distinguish a B with an ascender from a P with a descender. So if you had 3 O's written together, it would be you put an ascender on the first one and a descender on the second one, it would say bop. If you put a descender on the first one and a descender on the last one, it would say pop. If you put a ascender on the first and nothing on the other two, it would say boo. So in a sense, this is how it was. So the text needed people who knew how to actually read the text in order to recite it properly. And this was the nature of written Arabic at the time. So the question arises, when did we get the dots and the vowels? This isn't known exactly. According to Islamic tradition, Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, who had been a student of Ali bin Abi Talib in Kufa, was the first person to initiate this process of adding dots to distinguish one similarly shaped consonant from another. There is not, however, any manuscript evidence to support this. I have a suspicion that perhaps he may have indicated some rudimentary forms of distinguishing consonants from one another in this way, but it isn't something that became systematic. In fact, even in the Uthmanic period, even in the Umayyad period, which goes from 661 to 750, we still find manuscripts that don't have dots. We still find manuscripts, some of which have different systems for dots even within the same manuscript of the Quran. So clearly, there wasn't a fully systemized way to do it. There wasn't a consensus that had formed across the Islamic world. It's not, in fact, until the Abbasid period that we get this consensus across the Islamic world. Now, as we look at this history, there aren't any manuscripts of the collections attributed to the early companions. We don't have a manuscript of the collection of Ali bin Abi Talib, or Abdullah bin Mas'ud, or Ubay bin Ka'ab, or Salim al-Hudhayfa, or any of this. And chances are we probably never will. So all of these are things that we only have the Islamic historiographical record to tell us about these accounts. And a lot of the story, how did the Quran get collected, and all of these are details that we may never really know in full. We can only go to the Islamic historical accounts to try and put the story together. One thing that we do know is that the more manuscripts that we find, the more it verifies that the Quran as we know it was definitely in this shape by the middle of the 7th century. That is the Rasm, the consonantal skeleton of the Quran, was present by the middle of the 7th century. There were different readings, and that is a process by which there were different sciences to narrow down to 10 what are known as official qira'at, or recitations of the Quran. But the recent work that's been done in the last 15, 20 years by people such as François de Roche, Batnam Sadiqi, Yassin Dutton, and others on the manuscripts has helped to clarify and confirm the broad outlines of the Islamic account of the time by which we had the Quran as we have it today. Again, thank you very much for watching this video, and if you found that this was useful, please like, share, and subscribe, and please be sure to watch the first video to put the whole thing together. I'm going to put a few possible readings, additional readings, in the top comment below, so if you did want to read more about this, then look there and you'll find additional materials. Thank you again. Take care.